I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are a powerful 15th century ruler.
Right, it's setting the scene.
Yeah, and you are receiving this highly secured diplomatic package. You're anticipating the usual stuff, like sealed trade documents, maybe a negotiated treaty, or a velvet-lined box containing royal correspondence.
Standard medieval statecraft, basically.
Exactly. But instead, your guards hand you this heavy sealed leather bag. You open it, and inside isn't parchment. It is a large glass and clay jar filled to the brim with, like, thick, viscous, wild honey.
Which is pretty unexpected.
Totally. And floating suspended inside that honey, staring out through the amber liquid, is the severed head of the most feared man in Eastern Europe.
Wow. I mean, it completely shatters all our modern expectations of, how heads of state interact or how political transitions of power are formally confirmed.
Definitely. It's intense.
Yeah, a severed head preserved in a jar of honey is just this incredibly visceral artifact of medieval realpolitik.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, since you follow this era, you already know the pop culture vampire myth. We don't need to rehash the Hollywood Dracula tropes today.
No, we're going much deeper than the movies.
Right. Today we are taking a deep dive into an absolutely fascinating historical breakdown for the YouTube channel History Quest. And our mission is to examine the gritty, desperate reality of late 1476.
Yeah, we are pulling back the curtain on the final, deeply unglamorous hours of Vlad the Third, the voivode of Wallachia.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand why that jar of honey was necessary in the first place, we have to look at a ruler who relied entirely on absolute terror.
Right.
Only to meet an end that was, well, just as chaotic and brutal as his own reign.
Because the historical reality on the ground during those freezing weeks in late 1476 is, it's one of immense political desperation.
It was a mess.
Exactly. Vlad had actually just reclaimed his throne, retaking the Wallachia capital of Bucharest. But his hold on power was incredibly fragile. I mean, he had been back on the throne for less than 2 months.
2 months is just a blink of an eye in medieval statecraft.
Oh, absolutely.
And the specific way he got that throne back is kind of the first domino to fall here. Because he didn't just march in with overwhelming local support, did he?
No, not at all.
He drove out an Ottoman-backed usurper named Basarab Leota, but Vlad only managed that because he had heavy imported military backing. He relied on forces from Stephen the Great of Moldavia and the Hungarian forces of Stephen V Bathory.
Yeah, because in the 15th century Balkans, political legitimacy was entirely dependent on physical military presence. You couldn't just claim the throne, you had to hold it.
Right, you needed boots on the ground.
Exactly. So Vlad had this massive multinational coalition. And for a fleeting moment, it looked like he had fully returned to power, ready to resume his iron-fisted rule. The usurper fled, and the capital was secured.
But medieval alliances operate a lot like a ruthless gig economy.
That's a great way to put it.
You hire the contractors, they bring their own tools, they do the specific job of kicking out the usurper, and then they leave. The armies of Moldavia and Hungary didn't stick around to garrison Vlad's fortresses.
They couldn't. The economics of medieval warfare simply didn't allow for it. Keeping a massive multinational army in the field during the bitter cold of a Wallachian winter was astronomically expensive.
Because there's no food, right?
Exactly. During the spring or summer, an army can forage, they can live off the land, raid enemy farms, feed their horses on local grass. But in the dead of winter, nothing is growing.
The ground is just frozen solid.
Right. Every ounce of grain for the soldiers and the horses has to be purchased at premium prices. And then transported in carts over freezing mud roads. I mean, it can literally bankrupt a state in weeks.
Wow. So feeling the financial burn and basically believing the region was secure, Vlad's allies marched north to protect their own borders.
Leaving Vlad highly exposed.
Yeah, they leave him holding the bag with what the sources describe as a skeleton crew. He's left with perhaps fewer than 4,000 loyal men to hold a kingdom completely surrounded by enemies.
Which leads directly into a fatal miscalculation. Vlad and his departed allies assumed Basarab Leota was a neutralized threat.
That he was just gone for good.
Right. They thought he had simply retreated south across the Danube River. But once there, he didn't just lick his wounds. He immediately tapped into his own alliance network and was bolstered by fresh, elite reinforcements from the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, wow. So he bounced right back.
He did. The moment the Hungarian and Moldavian forces marched north, Leota turned the Ottoman war machine around and marched right back into Wallachia.
Catching the defenders completely exposed.
Completely.
The historical sources note that the exact location of this final battle is obscured by time. But we know it happened somewhere on the road between Bucharest and the fortified Danube port of Juju, and the conditions are absolutely miserable.
Just the worst possible weather for a battle.
Yeah, we're talking heavy fog, freezing dirt, and dense forests that have been stripped bare by winter. So there's zero natural cover for a small force trying to maneuver.
And Leotas isn't just bringing standard troops either. He's backed by the Ottoman Janissary infantry.
Which is a huge deal.
A massive deal. These aren't seasonal fighters. The Janissaries were an elite, highly disciplined standing army. They were paid in cash, trained year-round, and utilized cutting-edge military formations and firearms.
So they are marching in this coordinated, relentless vanguard against a Wallachian force that is vastly outnumbered and totally disorganized.
Precisely. It was a tactical nightmare.
Wait, I have to push back on this, though, because Vlad was famous for surviving impossible odds.
He was.
I mean, his entire historical reputation was built on scorched earth policies, psychological warfare, and devastating night attacks. He shattered enemy morale for a living. Even against Janissaries, a freezing, foggy forest feels like the ultimate equalizer. Why couldn't he just guerrilla warfare his way out of this specific ambush?
What's fascinating here is that this specific tactical failure exposes the fundamental flaw in ruling a state entirely through terror.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, to centralize his own absolute power during his previous reigns, Vlad had systematically decimated the Wallachian nobility, the boyar class. He impaled them by the hundreds, specifically to break their political and military influence.
Ah, so by killing off the boyars, he essentially liquidated his own upper management. He created a system with a single point of failure, which was himself.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. The boyars were the military elite whose traditional job was to raise, supply, and lead the peasant levies. By destroying that officer class, Vlad broke the chain of command.
So there was no middle management to give orders.
Right. When you're trying to execute a complex guerrilla maneuver or a coordinated night attack in the fog, you need lieutenants you can trust to lead autonomous units. Vlad had none. Instead, he had peasant levies.
Literally just farmers.
Yeah, just farmers dragged out of their freezing homes, handed weapons, and told to fight.
And when you are a freezing farmer, staring down an overwhelming wave of professional Ottoman Janissaries, fear of your ruler doesn't inspire you to fight to the death.
Not at all.
Fear only works when the ruler has the upper hand. When the tide of battle turns, your loyalty shifts immediately to your own survival, not to the prince who might impale you tomorrow if you retreat.
Exactly. Because of that complete lack of institutional loyalty and morale, the Wallachian lines simply dissolved. There was no grand strategy left to deploy, no elaborate traps.
They just folded.
Yeah, the highly disciplined Janissaries utilized their superior numbers to completely collapse the Wallachian flanks in a matter of minutes.
So it basically devolves into a fragmented, brutal skirmish. It's just desperate shouting and men dying in the fog among the bare trees.
Complete chaos.
And this absolute decentralized chaos seamlessly explains why the actual death of Vlad the Impaler is so murky. The military structure broke down so completely that there was no one left to accurately record what happened.
Which is why we're left with two very different historical theories on how he actually took his final breath. The fog of war quite literally obscures the final blow.
Let's talk about the first one.
Sure. The first theory is derived from a surviving account by the Russian diplomat Fyodor Kurutzin, and it suggests a tragic, chaotic accident born out of poor visibility.
Right, because in Kurutzin's account, the Wallachians actually managed to repel an initial Ottoman surge. And Vlad, who has this notoriously aggressive lead-from-the-front command style, rides up to the top of a small hill to observe the retreating enemy.
But in doing so, he pulls away from his personal bodyguard.
Yeah. And in the heavy fog and the generally chaotic visibility of a 15th century battlefield, his own men look up, see a lone rider in ornate armor on a hill, and mistake him for an Ottoman commander coordinating a flank.
It's just a devastating mistake. Before Vlad can identify himself, his own soldiers strike him down. They deliver a fatal blow, only realizing seconds later that they've just killed their own sovereign.
It's an absurd, entirely unheroic end for a man renowned as a master tactician.
Truly. But the second theory suggests a far more calculated, cold-blooded end. Because we can't forget about those boyars.
Right. The few nobles who survived Vlad's purges and were currently marching with him.
Exactly. They knew Lyota was returning with an overwhelming force. And the sources point out these nobles weren't just passively waiting for the battle. They had secretly maintained back-channel communications with the Ottomans.
Wait, Really, they were already talking to the enemy.
Oh, absolutely. They were actively hedging their bets to save their estates and their lives. The Ottoman Empire was a pragmatic machine. They frequently allowed local lords to keep their lands as long as they paid tribute and eliminated problematic rulers.
So in this second narrative, Vlad isn't struck by some blind lance in the fog. He is assassinated in the thick of the fighting by his own men.
Right.
The boyars do the math, decide his reign is officially a political liability, and strike him down from behind. Here's where it gets really interesting. The dark irony of that assassination theory.
Oh, the irony is thick.
Vlad spent his entire life trying to break the boyars through fear. He thought he could terrify them into absolute submission. Yet ultimately, it was their quiet, calculated self-interest that put a blade in his back. He engineered the exact conditions of his own betrayal.
It perfectly encapsulates the limits of ruling by fear. A terrified subordinate is always looking for the safest exit.
Always.
But whatever the exact mechanism of his death, whether it was an accident in the fog or an orchestrated assassination by his own generals, what happened immediately after he fell is a stark demonstration of how political power operated on the medieval frontier.
Because in 1476, a dead prince on a battlefield is really just a rumor. Tsar Bleota and his Ottoman backers couldn't just declare victory and assume the throne.
No, they needed proof.
Right. To pacify the region and definitively claim power, they needed undeniable physical proof that the Impaler was dead.
And they certainly didn't treat his remains with the customary respect afforded to Christian nobility. I mean, there was no preparation of the body for state transport. They performed a battlefield decapitation on his corpse right there in the freezing mud.
They took a man who had commanded absolute, terrifying authority, and they stripped him of his heavy furs and his identifiable armor, taking it all as battlefield loot. They reduced him to a gruesome piece of political currency.
And this kicks off an incredible logistical nightmare because they have to transport the severed head from the freezing plains of Wallachia all the way to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople.
Which is a journey of over 400 miles.
Right. It requires crossing the vast Danube River, navigating through the treacherous freezing passes of the Balkan Mountains, and traveling down into the Thracian plains.
And speed was essential for political reasons. But, decomposition is a biological reality. Even in the cold, tissue breaks down, and an unrecognizable head is useless as political proof.
Which brings us to the chemistry behind our opening image. To solve this logistical nightmare, they used a method that is essentially like curing a ham, but applied to a severed head.
It's so morbid.
It really is. They submerged Vlad's head in a container filled with wild honey. It relies on a process called osmotic shock.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, honey is basically heavily supersaturated sugar. It has a very low water content, but a high ability to absorb moisture. When you submerge flesh in honey, the sugar draws the water out of the organic cells through osmosis.
Right, because water moves to where the sugar is.
Exactly. And bacteria, which cause decomposition, need water to multiply. So in that hypersugary environment, the bacteria are rapidly dehydrated and either go dormant or die.
It's basically chemical mummification. It's like morbid Tupperware.
Morbid Tupperware is a perfect way to describe it.
It arrested the decay of the flesh entirely, ensuring that by the time the courier finished that 400-mile ride to Constantinople, Vlad's facial features would still be perfectly recognizable.
And it had to be recognizable, because the man waiting for that delivery was Sultan Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror.
And Mehmed had a very deep, very personal history with Vlad.
Oh, to understand the gravity of the Sultan receiving that jar, we have to look back 14 years to the summer of 1462. Mehmed had personally led a massive invasion force into Wallachia, fully intending to turn the territory into an Ottoman province.
And Vlad didn't just meet the Sultan on an open battlefield. No, he launched a daring, chaotic night attack directly into the Ottoman encampment. He was specifically trying to assassinate Mehmed right in his own royal tent.
Which is incredibly bold. The assassination attempt barely failed, but it inflicted profound psychological damage on the Ottoman forces, and the psychological warfare only escalated from there.
Yeah, because days later, as Mehmed's army marched toward the Wallachian capital of Targovite, they encountered a sight that literally halted the advance of the entire Ottoman war machine.
The force of the impaled.
Over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners of war, along with Wallachian civilians who had simply been in the wrong place, all impaled on tall wooden stakes and left to rot in the summer sun.
It's hard to even picture that scale of horror.
The source note that the Greek historian Lamerco Chalkokondyles actually recorded the Sultan's reaction. Mehmed, a man who had conquered Constantinople, a man who shattered empires, stood in stunned silence. He marveled at the sheer scale of the ruthless psychological warfare deployed by this localized Wallachian prince.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the delivery of that honey jar 14 years later represents the conclusion of one of the most bitter personal rivalries of the era.
The architect of that horrific forest was finally dead.
Yes. Mehmed ordered the head to be taken out of the honey, cleaned of the sticky resin, and prepared for public display.
They drove his head onto a high wooden stake and erected it in a prominent public square in Constantinople. It's just a dark, poetic justice. The man who revolutionized the wooden stake as an instrument of state terror ended his own story mounted on one.
It served as the ultimate psychological victory for the Ottoman state. You have the citizens of Constantinople, many of whom had likely lost family members, or new soldiers who died in Vlad's campaigns gathering to look up at his preserved features.
Staring up at him.
Right. His heavy mustache, his intense eyes, now just a lifeless stare over the imperial capital. It sent a clear, undeniable message to any vassal state considering rebellion. The Sultan's reach is absolute and no enemy escapes Ottoman justice.
The source mentions the head stayed up on that stake until the elements and scavenging birds reduced it to nothing. But, while all of this highly visible, monumental display is happening in Constantinople, a completely different kind of story is playing out back in the Wallachian winter.
A completely silent story.
Right. While his head was turned into a highly visible monument of imperial power, his headless body in Wallachia required the exact opposite treatment: total erasure.
Because a royal burial in the 15th century wasn't just about respecting the dead, it was a deeply political act. A marked tomb is a final assertion of legitimacy. It anchors a dynasty's claim to the land. But Vlad's remains were denied that basic right of sovereignty.
Vlad the Impaler couldn't give him a state funeral. Honoring Vlad would be an act of treason against his own new regime. Plus, there is a very practical danger here. If you build an elaborate, marked grave for Vlad the Impaler, you are essentially building a focal point for future rebellions.
Exactly. You're creating a martyr shrine where his loyalists can gather, mourn, and plot against you.
Consequently, the historical record surrounding his body fragments. The new state officially abandons the corpse to the mercy of scavengers. However, centuries of local folklore and monastic traditions suggest that local peasants, or perhaps monks who recognize his armorless body, carried the remains away under the cover of darkness.
It's a powerful legend.
It is. For generations, the prevailing legend was that he was secretly buried at the Snagov Monastery. It's this heavily fortified island in the middle of a lake near Bucharest that Vlad himself had expanded and funded.
It sounds perfectly dramatic, an isolated, water-bound fortress serving as the final resting place for a man surrounded by enemies.
But modern archaeology throws a fascinating wrench into that perfect folklore. In the early 1930s, a Romanian archaeologist named Dinu Rossetti secured permission to excavate the presumed tomb of Vlad the Impaler, which was prominently located right in front of the altar at Snagov Monastery.
And what they found, or rather didn't find, is incredible.
Right. They lift this massive, heavy stone slab, expecting to find the headless skeleton of the voivode. And instead, they find a decoy.
A complete fake-out.
Yeah? They dig down and find only loose dirt, some fragmented ceramics, and a collection of animal bones.
It was a deliberate misdirection. Whoever buried the remains knew that political enemies or grave robbers would eventually come looking for the body to desecrate it. But the excavation didn't end at the altar.
No, it didn't.
Further back in the church, in a completely unassuming area near the entrance, the archaeologists found a second, completely unmarked pit.
And inside this hidden grave, they uncovered a skeleton missing its skull. But the real archaeological smoking gun wasn't just the missing head. The skeleton was draped in the decaying, fragmented remains of purple velvet and yellow silk.
Which is huge. Those fabrics are incredibly significant. In the 15th century, the dyes required to make rich purple, often Tyrian purple or similar high-end colorants and imported silk, were astonishingly expensive. More importantly, they were governed by strict sumptuary laws.
Meaning it was literally illegal for a commoner to wear them.
Exactly.
If a random peasant or even a low-level merchant was caught wearing yellow silk or purple velvet, they could be executed. Finding those specific, highly regulated materials surviving in an unmarked pit is definitive scientific proof that the headless body belonged to high nobility.
While some historians firmly believe this combination of the missing skull, the location, and the royal fabrics proves it is Vlad, others argue his remains might actually be at the Kamana Monastery. which is another religious house closer to the battlefield.
Right, there are competing theories.
Because the men who buried him left no identifying inscriptions to protect the grave, absolute certainty will always be out of reach.
So what does this all mean? Look at the incredible, jarring contrast of his life versus his death. You have a ruler who forced the entire world to acknowledge his presence through spectacular, monumental acts of violence.
It was impossible to ignore.
He literally altered the landscape with bodies so you could not look away from him. And yet, he is ultimately forced into the earth in total silence, his body hidden beneath an unmarked stone.
This raises an important question about the nature of power and the mechanics of history. When we strip away the supernatural vampire folklore, Vlad the Impaler was not a mythical entity.
He's just a guy.
He was a localized prince utilizing extreme cruelty as a blunt instrument of statecraft to hold together a fractured, vulnerable state. But a blunt instrument eventually shatters. He was ultimately overtaken by the larger, more organized, and more systemic military cruelty of an empire.
It really makes you reflect on the legacy of fear. When you rely solely on terror to centralize your power, you might achieve short-term control. But you inevitably strip away the very loyalty and institutional support you need to survive a freezing winter ambush.
It creates a hollow foundation.
Yeah. Vlad built his entire world on fear, and in the end, fear didn't save him, it just left him isolated in the mud, surrounded by men waiting for a chance to strike him down.
The individuals who carried his headless body to that unmarked pit did so deliberately. They were seeking to protect his corpse from further desecration by his enemies. They sought to give him peace through total anonymity.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. By deliberately erasing his identity, by utilizing decoy tombs and leaving a physical void in the historical record, those monks inadvertently changed history.
They really did.
They created an informational vacuum, allowing his legacy to mutate over the centuries into something entirely unrecognizable. Think about it. If Vlad the Impaler had received a normal, highly visible, marked royal tomb with his name carved in stone, would the supernatural myth of Dracula have ever been able to take root? Or does a true monstrous mythology actually require the mystery of an empty grave to grow? Because in the end, it wasn't the man preserved in the jar of honey that survived the centuries. It was the shadow that rose out of the empty dirt.